So uh, I want you to imagine a historical figure who just, flat out refused to acknowledge his own childhood. Like, no human parents wouldn't even use his real name.
Right, just completely erased his backstory.
Exactly. And the reason he did this, because he claimed he was literally God.
I mean, it sounds totally made up, like something out of a surreal fiction novel.
It really does. But I want you, the listener, to paint a picture in your mind of a man who built this massive real estate empire, was targeted by a furious suburban mob, and who supposedly smote a judge right from his prison cell.
Yeah, and every single bit of that sequence is actually firmly rooted in the historical record.
It's wild. So our focus for this deep dive is tracing the mechanics behind that astonishing evolution of the man who became known as Father Divine.
We're basically bypassing the standard biographical bullet points here. We want to look directly at the engine of his movement.
Right, because we need to figure out how a man who started out as, just an obscure gardener transformed into the founder of the International Peace Mission movement.
A movement where he amassed incredible wealth, fiercely advocated for civil rights, and this is he built fully integrated communities during the absolute heights of segregation.
And during the Great Depression, no less.
Exactly. Recognizing the underlying framework of his organization is crucial. I mean, this isn't merely a story about fringe theology.
Right.
It is basically a masterclass in alternative economics, sociology, and just the deployment of sheer charismatic authority against systemic barriers.
So for you listening, this deep dive is going to demonstrate how a religious movement that might initially appear to be built on delusions of grandeur actually function as a highly practical, tangible support system.
Because charisma alone doesn't build an empire.
Right. No, definitely not. Providing a material safety net during an era of extreme economic desperation, that does.
Yeah. And to understand how a mortal transitions into a deity in the eyes of thousands, we really have to examine that deliberate erasure of his human origins you mentioned.
Right, because when someone claims divine status, an earthly backstory is kind of a liability.
Oh, a massive liability. He actively blocked biographers. He refused to acknowledge family ties, asserting that, a divine history could not be captured in mortal terms.
But researchers did eventually track some of it down, right?
They did. By analyzing census data and regional records, they strongly believe his given name was George Baker.
And the historical context surrounding his early life actually provides the perfect environment for that kind of reinvention.
Totally.
I mean, being born to freed slaves, likely in the deep south of Georgia or maybe an African-American enclave in Maryland, meant existing in a society where public records for marginalized communities were notoriously inconsistent.
Yeah, the paperwork just wasn't there.
Exactly. That lack of a paper trail effectively handed him a blank canvas.
It really did. And around the turn of the century, while he was working as a gardener in Baltimore, he actually traveled out to California.
Okay, quite a trip back then.
Yeah, and this trip exposed him to this booming philosophical trend called the New Thought movement.
Ah, New Thought.
Right. It was this framework preaching that the human mind has the power to shape physical reality, meaning like positive thinking could actively prevent poverty and unhappiness.
I want to just pause on the psychological utility of that specific philosophy.
Yeah, go ahead.
For a black man living under the crushing weight of Jim Crow laws, adopting a theology that says, you can control your physical destiny purely through your internal mindset, that must have been profoundly empowering.
Oh, absolutely.
It essentially offers this psychological override to systemic oppression.
That is the exact mechanism at play here. Because traditional theology often preached, endurance and suffering in this life for a reward in the afterlife.
Right, the whole wait for heaven idea.
Exactly. But New Thought inverted that. It suggested salvation and prosperity were accessible immediately if you just mastered your consciousness.
So armed with this perspective, he returns east.
Yes. And that sets the stage for a critical theological collision. So in 1907, he enters a local church where a traveling preacher named Samuel Morris suddenly throws his arms up and just declares himself to be the eternal Father.
Wow. And rather than viewing this man as unhinged, our subject basically becomes his very first disciple.
Yep, he buys right in. Morris adopts the title Father Jehovah, representing God the Father, and the future Father Divine takes the title the Messenger.
Kind of acting as the Christ-like son in this scenario.
Exactly. And eventually they fold a third man into the mix, John Hickerson, who goes by Reverend Bishop St. John the Vine. So they essentially create their own self-contained trinity.
But the structural integrity of that trinity was inherently flawed, wasn't it?
Oh, deeply flawed.
Mm.
By 1912, they had this severe theological dispute that just shattered the group.
What happened?
Well, Hickerson argued for a more democratic interpretation of divinity. He claimed that God is present in absolutely everyone.
Okay, sure.
But the messenger completely rejected this. He parted ways with the group and declared that he, and he alone, was the sole true expression of God's spirit.
It honestly reminds me of a garage band breaking up because the backup singer suddenly announced he actually invented the concept of music.
That is a perfect analogy.
But beyond the sheer audacity of it, that theological pivot is brilliant from a power perspective.
Oh, entirely.
Because if God is in everyone, like Hickerson claimed, then authority is decentralized. Nobody has leverage. But by declaring himself the singular embodiment of the divine, he completely monopolizes the spiritual authority.
Right, that centralization of power was the crucial first step. He positioned himself not as a guide to heaven, but as the literal manifestation of heaven on earth.
But declaring absolute authority in a vacuum doesn't build a movement.
No, it doesn't. He needed to test this doctrine in the real world, which meant taking his message on the road, straight through the Deep South.
And doing that brought some pretty immediate, severe consequences.
To put it mildly, preaching in Georgia around 1913, he clashed violently with local norms. I mean, he began demanding strict celibacy from his followers.
Wow.
Yeah, and completely rejected traditional gender categorizations.
Well, naturally, telling husbands and wives to stop functioning as traditional subservient units in the early 20th century South, that did not go over well.
No, it was viewed as an existential threat to the social order. The local authorities actually sentenced him to 60 days on a chain gang.
Just for preaching celibacy and equality.
Basically, yeah. And when he persisted after his release, local ministers and husbands actually rallied to have him legally committed. This resulted in a full-blown lunacy trial in 1914.
The bureaucratic details of that trial are just almost unbelievable to me.
Oh, the name thing.
Yes, because he absolutely refused to provide his earthly name, the legal system was literally forced to try him under the official alias of John Doe, alias God.
It's incredible. And that moment functioned as a massive legitimizing event for his emerging persona. Well, despite holding beliefs that the local establishment found completely manic, a respected local attorney actually took his case pro bono.
Really?
Yeah. And the court ultimately found him mentally sound. He wasn't a lunatic. He was legally recognized as a man in full control of his faculties who simply, believed he was divine.
So surviving the Southern justice system like that seems to have just accelerated his ambitions.
Definitely. By 1914, he relocated up north to Brooklyn with a small, all-black congregation.
And they establish a commune in an apartment building, right?
Right. And this is where the real operational blueprint of his future empire takes shape. He institutes incredibly severe boundaries for his followers.
Like what?
Absolute celibacy and a total ban on alcohol, tobacco, and gambling.
See, those restrictions might seem kind of counterintuitive if you want to recruit people.
You think so, yeah.
But in the sociology of high cohesion groups, strict behavioral purification serves a really vital purpose. It forces a wedge between the followers and the outside world.
Exactly. It isolates them.
Right. If your lifestyle is completely incompatible with mainstream society, you become entirely dependent on the commune for your social and emotional survival.
That's spot on. And this also coincides with another massive rebranding. He adopts the grandiose title of Reverend Major Jealous Divine.
Explicitly referencing the Old Testament passages about a jealous deity.
Yep. And simultaneously, he marries an older follower named Penaniah.
Now, wait a minute. The logic here totally fractures for me.
How do you mean?
Well, if the foundational premise of his movement is that he is a supreme, self-sufficient deity who requires absolute celibacy from his followers, what possible strategic value does taking a human wife offer?
Okay, so the marriage was strictly unconsummated to maintain that theological rule of celibacy. But functionally, it solved a major optics problem.
Oh, because of the demographics of his followers.
Exactly. He was an incredibly charismatic leader surrounded by dozens of young, devoted female followers. Taking a respected older wife immediately diffused any external rumors of impropriety.
Ah, it gave him cover.
Right. It lent the entire operation a critical air of respectability in conservative 1910s America.
Looking at how their organization functioned, Penaniah's role feels highly analogous to, like, the chief operating officer of a visionary tech startup.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You have Father Divine supplying the lofty, abstract, world-bending theology, and then you have Penaniah grounding that vision into a highly effective logistical operation.
Yeah, she was the boots on the ground. Specifically, she pioneered their free community dinners.
And those banquets were the engine of their early growth.
Absolutely. She essentially translated his abstract concept of heaven on earth into a literal physical reality, like a hot, abundant meal served in a safe, pristine environment.
For marginalized people struggling in early 20th century New York, that tangible display of abundance was the ultimate proof of his divinity.
It was undeniable to them.
Yeah.
But the success of that operation in Brooklyn actually created a logistical bottleneck.
They just ran out of room.
Yeah, they simply outgrew the apartment,
Okay.
which forced a move out to the suburbs in 1919.
And the mechanics of how they acquired their new headquarters in Sayville, New York, out on Long Island, are fascinating.
The spite sale.
Yes. They became the first black homeowners in that town because a white resident who was locked in some petty feud with a neighbor deliberately sold his property to a black buyer, specifically to tank the local property values.
Just a localized spite play that inadvertently provided Father Divine with the sprawling estate he needed to scale up his vision.
It's poetic. And in Sayville, he expanded Penaniah's blueprint, right?
He did. The commune began hosting these massive, lavish banquets and operating sophisticated job placement services for members.
Crucially, this operation resulted in a fully integrated community. You have black and white followers living, working, and dining together.
Which was practically unheard of.
Think about the visual impact of this in the 1920s. You have a black man driving a Cadillac, presiding over a sprawling suburban estate, surrounded by a racially integrated flock who literally view him as the almighty.
The local white establishment was completely unequipped to process that level of disruption.
And their inability to process it manifested as intense hostility.
Oh, extremely intense. Neighbors started manufacturing these wild accusations, claiming the estate was a front for a scandalous harem.
Which was investigated, right?
Yeah. The district attorney looked into these claims and found absolutely zero evidence. In reality, the commune operated under draconian rules.
Like what kind of rules?
Strict curfews, mandatory celibacy, and prohibitions against even singing past 8 in the evening.
Wow, so no parties.
Not at all. But the underlying racial prejudice of the era simply could not tolerate the existence of a wealthy, integrated, black-led community.
So that tension eventually explodes in late 1931.
It does. The neighbors basically weaponized a noise complaint over one of the massive Sunday banquets, and that prompted state troopers to raid the compound. Dozens of followers were arrested.
I love the bureaucratic friction that happened next,
Yeah.
because the followers utterly refused to give their given name.
Right. They frustrated the booking clerks to no end by only offering their newly adopted spiritual names.
It's just such a perfect act of defiance. So the resulting trial in 1932 evolved into this national media spectacle.
It really did. And the jury, perhaps recognizing the underlying prejudice driving the charges, found him guilty of disturbing the peace. But they explicitly requested that the judge show leniency in sentencing.
But the presiding judge, Louis J. Smith, completely ignored the jury's recommendation.
Completely threw it out.
He hit Father Divine with the maximum possible sentence, a year in prison and a massive fine, while delivering this blistering lecture, branding him a fraud and a menace to the fabric of society.
But the fallout from that courtroom scene is unparalleled.
Unmatched in history. Because just days after handing down that maximum sentence, Judge Smith suddenly drops dead from a heart attack.
The timing was an absolute gift to the movement's mythology.
Oh, sitting in his prison cell, Father Divine capitalized on it masterfully.
What'd he say?
He released a public statement expressing, deep regret that his spirit had been forced to take such fatal action against the judge.
Unbelievable.
Consider the sheer, unimaginable public relations leverage of that moment for you listening. A judge locks up a man claiming to be God and immediately drops dead. It is the ultimate confirmation bias for anyone on the fence about his divinity.
Oh, it functioned as an irresistible hook for the national press. The media entirely glossed over the fact that the judge had a documented history of severe heart issues.
Why let facts ruin a good story?
Right. To the broader public, it read as undeniable divine retribution. That single biological coincidence transformed him from a localized nuisance into a fetch of awe-inspiring, terrifying power.
And following his subsequent release on appeal, the Sayville suburbs were far too small to contain his new profile.
Oh yeah, the sheer scale of that PR victory dictated a massive strategic pivot.
So in 1932, right as the Great Depression is plunging the country into absolute despair, he moves his headquarters to New York City.
And officially rebrands the movement as the International Peace Mission.
This relocation to Harlem is really where his underlying economic genius fully materializes.
Yeah, when we examine the structural mechanics of the peace mission during this era, we see the creation of a completely closed-loop parallel economy.
They began aggressively acquiring real estate across the Northeast. They purchased multiple hotels and apartment buildings, which they branded as heavens.
And followers could live and work in these facilities for pennies on the dollar.
They even acquired a hotel near Atlantic City for the specific purpose of ensuring black citizens could access the segregated beaches.
Which is incredible activism through real estate. They ran a network of cash-only restaurants, clothing shops, and grocery stores that stripped overhead costs to the absolute bone.
This model allowed the International Peace Mission to become the largest single property owner in Harlem during the worst economic crisis in American history.
It's staggering. While traditional businesses collapsed under the weight of debt and frozen credit, his cash-only, labor-rich ecosystem was perfectly adapted to not just survive, but actively expand.
It operates almost exactly like a highly disciplined, subscription-based co-op.
Yeah, exactly.
The members pool all their wages, they eliminate the profit margins of external middlemen, and buy everything in massive bulk. Because the labor is essentially volunteer by the followers, the businesses can undercut every other store in Harlem.
It is an incredibly resilient economic fortress. By this point, his followers numbered in the tens of thousands, and his distinct brand of positive thinking theology began bleeding into mainstream culture.
The cultural penetration was significant. The core tenets of his sermons, focusing strictly on the positive and refusing to acknowledge the negative, were so ubiquitous that they actually served as the direct inspiration for popular music of the era.
Right. It most notably influenced the thematic framework of a major 1940s hit song about accentuating the positive.
Despite this massive cultural and economic footprint, though, he initially maintained a strict political neutrality.
He did, but that posture shifted radically following the Harlem Riot of 1935, which was an uprising triggered by systemic police violence.
The destruction in his immediate neighborhood seemed to act as a catalyst, like a realization of his own political leverage.
Yeah, he began aggressively weaponizing his congregation. By 1939, he was organizing massive political conventions.
And drafting sophisticated platforms, right?
Yes. They demanded the immediate end of school segregation and proposed comprehensive anti-lynching legislation. Within a year, his organization gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures for a statute he helped draft.
He was utilizing religious devotion to demand systemic civil rights changes decades ahead of the mainstream movement of the 1950s and 60s.
Very ahead of his time.
But this brings up a massive ideological contradiction that we need to untangle here.
Okay, let's hear it.
At the exact same time he is mobilizing this incredible fight for marginalized citizens, he is fiercely condemning FDR's New Deal welfare programs.
Oh, yeah.
He preached a hyper-strict doctrine of rugged capitalism, actively forbidding his followers from accepting any form of government assistance. How do you reconcile a civil rights pioneer with an anti-welfare capitalist?
So the reconciliation lies back in that foundational New Thought philosophy he adopted decades earlier in California.
Okay, walk me through that.
His theology dictated that the individual consciousness shapes reality. Therefore, to accept government welfare was, within his theological framework, a public admission of spiritual failure.
Like admitting you lacked faith in the divine provision.
Exactly. He didn't view the capitalist system as inherently broken. He believed individuals simply lacked the correct spiritual alignment and economic discipline to succeed within it.
So he wasn't asking for a share of the government's resources because he believed he had built a superior, independent kingdom.
Right.
So he constructs this self-sustaining, deeply influential empire that appears completely impenetrable to outside forces.
It appeared that way, yes. But the structural integrity of a movement built entirely on the premise of physical immortality and absolute authority is, well, it's inherently fragile.
Because legal and biological realities were slowly eroding his foundation.
Inevitably.
The first major crack appears in 1937 with a lawsuit from a former follower named Verinda Brown.
Right. She and her husband had poured their entire life savings into the Sayville commune years earlier.
And when they defected from the movement, they demanded their capital back. And the court actually ruled in her favor, ordering the movement to return the funds.
See, the dollar amount wasn't really the issue for him. The legal precedent was an existential threat.
Because it pierced the protective veil of the commune.
Exactly. If one disillusioned follower could successfully sue to extract their communal donations, it opened the floodgates for thousands of others to do the very same thing.
Which would instantly bankrupt the entire international peace mission.
Overnight. So to avoid the payout and dodge the resulting contempt of court charges, he is forced to flee New York altogether.
In 1942, he relocates the headquarters to Pennsylvania. And it's during this chaotic transition that the movement's core theology faces its ultimate stress test.
Because in 1943, Penaniah, the mother of the faithful, dies.
Now remember, the bedrock of his doctrine promised physical immortality to those who remain purely faithful. So how does a movement process the death of its co-founder?
Through absolute institutionalized denial. He completely ignored her death. He refused to acknowledge it to the congregation and basically ensured she was never spoken of again.
Consider the immense cognitive dissonance required to sustain that environment.
It's hard to fathom.
The psychological toll of leading a community where you are forced to pretend your longtime partner hasn't died, simply to prevent your entire theological framework from collapsing. That must have been overwhelming.
Well, it exposes the ultimate trap of claiming physical divinity, doesn't it?
Definitely.
When your authority relies on the promise of conquering death, biological reality becomes your greatest adversary. Every follower who falls ill, every sign of aging, and certainly the death of a spouse, functions as a direct threat to the legitimacy of your power.
The isolation of maintaining that facade, of suppressing any natural human grief just to protect the brand of being God, is profound.
And his eventual solution to the absence of Penaniah requires another massive theological leap.
Right. In 1946, now roughly 70 years old, he secretly marries a 21-year-old Canadian woman named Edna Rose Richings.
Quite an age gap.
Yeah, and when he finally presents her to the celibate congregation, he justifies the marriage by introducing a brand new concept. He claims she is the miraculous physical reincarnation of Penaniah.
And keep in mind, reincarnation was entirely absent from his doctrine prior to this moment.
Not a peep about it before.
None. It was a rapid, highly convenient theological patch, designed specifically to explain away the disappearance of his first wife, while simultaneously justifying his union with a new young bride.
To a community strictly forbidden from sexual relationships, no less.
Exactly.
And the wild part is, the followers overwhelmingly bought into it.
They accepted the patch.
So he spends his twilight years insulated in profound luxury, residing on a sprawling 72-acre French Gothic estate in Pennsylvania known as Woodmont.
Which had been gifted by a wealthy follower.
Right. However, as the American post-war economy surged in the 1950s, the desperate survival-level need for his cheap communal housing evaporated.
People just didn't need the safety net as badly anymore.
Exactly. The movement's numbers dwindled, the press lost interest, and he eventually passes away from natural causes in 1965.
And following his death, leadership transferred entirely to his young widow, Edna Rose, who was tasked with managing the declining organization.
Which sets the stage for one of the most bizarre historical intersections of the 20th century.
Oh, this part is wild.
In 1972, a younger, increasingly infamous cult leader attempts a hostile corporate-style takeover of the peace mission.
And that leader was Jim Jones, the man who would eventually orchestrate the Jonestown Massacre.
It's such a dark crossover.
It really is. Jones deeply studied the mechanics of charismatic leadership. He attempted to legitimize his takeover by claiming that he was the literal reincarnation of Father Divine.
Using the very same reincarnation patch Father Divine invented.
Yep. Hoping to seamlessly absorb the remaining wealthy congregation and all their assets into his people's temple.
But Edna Rose saw right through the maneuver and successfully blocked the takeover, protecting the empire's remaining assets.
Jones failed to acquire the organization, though he heavily co-opted several of the peace mission's administrative techniques.
Like what?
Like the mandatory recording and archiving of every single sermon.
Wow. It serves as a grim reminder of how the highly effective logistical machinery of a high-cohesion movement can easily be reverse-engineered,
Manipulated.
repurposed for deeply destructive ends by a different kind of leader.
Synthesizing this sprawling narrative, it is clear we are looking at a profoundly complex architect of social organization.
Yeah, he managed to weave together the era's positive thinking philosophies, an uncompromising belief in self-sustaining capitalism, and highly effective civil rights activism.
All wrapped entirely within the framework of a self-deified religious movement.
He was, above all, a brilliant logistical
He
strategist.
really was. He understood that abstract theology is ultimately hollow if it doesn't address material desperation.
By engineering a closed-loop economy that provided a tangible shelter against the compounding horrors of the Great Depression and Jim Crow segregation, he basically secured absolute devotion.
He essentially forced the physical world to conform to his spiritual claims by providing for his followers fundamental survival needs.
And for you listening, that is the crucial takeaway for anyone analyzing how alternative power structures are built.
Because absolute ideological conviction alone isn't enough.
No. But when married to hyper-practical community support-like, outcompeting the local housing market and controlling a reliable food supply, it can generate a sprawling, intensely loyal empire, even in the face of immense systemic headwinds.
The legacy of that operational blueprint is undeniable, even if the theological claims driving it seem entirely disconnected from reality today.
Which leaves us with a fascinating dynamic to consider moving forward.
What's that?
Well, when you look at the modern landscape of, say, hyper-curated influencer economies, or massive contemporary megachurches, where followers essentially subscribe to a highly insulated lifestyle brand managed by a seemingly infallible, charismatic persona.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. Are we just witnessing the sanitized 21st century evolution of the exact same closed-loop ecosystem Father Divine perfected a century ago?